Jason Song, could you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, introduce myself. Well, I'm Jason Song. I'm president of the Scottsdale Historical Society. I'm president of the Camelback Cemetery Association. I am a second-generation native to Arizona. I grew up in Scottsdale and went to all three universities.
At which high school?
Coronado High School, which is just down the road.
Nice. So, Jason, you did a whole generational genealogical search of your family. What did you know about your grandfather before you started your search?
You know, very little. I did an interview when I was in college with a person that I called Uncle Martin, and he told me how we came to Arizona. My grandfather and grandmother came to Arizona following him. He was sponsored by someone in Mesa, and so they followed him because he and my grandmother were very, very, very close. I think she raised him from when he was an infant. So that's who he thought of as his mom, more than his own mother.
And you of course, met your grandfather.
Yes. Yeah, he lived on a house, when I knew him, he lived at a house on Miller and Indian School Road, kind of where the CVS is now.
And how old were you when he passed away?
Oh, let's see, he passed away in 1973, so I was 18 in 1975, so 13.
When you started doing your search, what were the sources of the information?
Well, I had done that interview with my uncle, and I had actually recorded that on a cassette tape, and I'd written up a little report that I turned in for my class when I was at the University of Arizona. Then I got much more interested in it. My cousin actually asked me to go to China with her to see our family, to meet our distant relatives. And I did that, and that kind of got me very interested in this. And that was just before COVID started. So as COVID started, I started doing more and more research. I made a request to the National Archives in San Francisco for my grandfather and for my grandmother. And that's where I really got started with this. I used Ancestry and the newspaper's database as well that was tied to Ancestry.
So go over some of the steps that you took in your investigation of your family.
Well, since it was COVID when I made the request of the National Archives, it took them a while to get me the information, but what I got back was a PDF file that was probably 40 pages long on each of them. And that explained a lot about that. I learned that from those papers, from reading all the stuff in that archive report, that my grandfather was a paper son.
And what does that mean?
So back in 1894, I'm going to kind of go through this little PowerPoint I have, because that's a picture of my grandfather right there. And this is a picture of the village he lived in. That's one place I got to go visit. It's very typical of a Chinese, small Chinese village. Around the village are all the places they would grow rice. In this pond, almost every village would have a pond like this where they would grow fish. So they would have rice and fish, and then his house was right here. So it was kind of interesting to meet my distant relatives that knew that, and before we went there and met them, the tour had gone through this long piece with the university, a week long or more, talking about how people at that time lived. And so you can see this was in 19. Can you imagine how rural it was before then? I mean, it was really very much out in the sticks. It took us to get from Guangzhou to this place was at least an hour going on freeways until I got down to this little road that you can't even see. So yeah, this is where the village is, and Guangzhou is where we were staying. So it took forever, and you can see there's Macau and Hong Kong way over there. So it's all in the southern part of China, and that's where many people who migrated to the United States and other countries, South America, Australia, this was the region they came from for the most part. This is just part of the family tree. This is my great-great-grandfather. So, Zhou Song. And so this is my grandfather when he was very young, 18, 19 years old. He could read, he could write, which is very unusual for someone out in the country. And he wrote documents for a wealthy merchant who I believe helped him get into the country. At that time, China, there was a big civil war between the emperor and people who wanted to be free. You can imagine that wasn't a very good time since it was unsettled in many ways. There was bandits that were running around and, robbing people. And of course, there was famine. People were very, very hungry. They couldn't get enough food. So I think those are some of the reasons that he left China. But in 1882, the Chinese Exclusionary Act was passed. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, Bruce. The Exclusionary Act basically said no more Chinese can come into the country. And it was very specific to Chinese, because remember, they imported a lot of Chinese to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It's funny, I'm kind of going on a little side note. If you ever see that picture where they drove the Golden Spike, you'll see no Chinese people. None. Plenty of Irish, but no Chinese. So Chinese could not come over. There were actually Chinese being expelled from towns all over. It was really a rough time to be Chinese. So my grandfather was a paper son. And what that meant is years later, after the Exclusionary Act and people couldn't come in, there was the fire in San Francisco in 1906. And at that time, all the birth records for San Francisco and the surrounding area were kept in City Hall. Well, they all caught on fire. Well, since they were burned down, people could say, oh yeah, I was born here. So that means I can bring my children in, who I had through my wife in China. They can come into this country. But you might not have any children in China. So there was a gentleman named Ju Falk who sold papers to my grandfather that described the village and all these things about the village that he had to know, because Ju Falk was interviewed. They kept that record. When my grandfather came into the country, his answers needed to match that record. So, and this is Ju Falk and my grandfather. He came in on this ship, the SS China. It took 3 weeks to come from Hong Kong around through Japan all the way over to San Francisco. It was a mail ship that they used. You can see that it's not really made for too much comfort. It's kind of rough. This is a little piece of the interviews that they had to do. There was my grandfather and then his alleged father that they interviewed and his alleged brother that they interviewed. So all these alleged people, but they had their answers matched, and so they let him into the country. It was kind of important that, it had the seat that he had on the boat. That has been referenced time and time again. Not only the boat, not only the day it arrived, but also the seat that he had, the ticket number. So my grandfather also registered for the draft in World War I. And they tried to bring him into the service, but he couldn't pass the initial physical. He had to go to another bigger town to have another physical, and he was eventually denied entry into the army at that point. But he was living, at that time, he was living at a ranch out in Visalia. Census records have always been a wonderful place to get information. There were, I think, 30 people, a lot of them from back east, who worked at this, and my grandfather was the only person who was Chinese, and he was called the cook for these 30 people. So I'd missed that big gap. Meanwhile, back in China, so he married my grandmother when she was 14, and she raised Fong, that was my Uncle Martin, until my grandfather went back to China to get her. Of course, they could not have had children because he was at that time, 10 years old by the time she left. So these are some of the papers that he had when he came through Angel Island, where all the Chinese had to come through. And this was his attorney in San Francisco that he used to leave the country. This was actually his passport, his pass to leave the country, his 430 form. It's just like even nowadays, everybody's got their forms, for your taxes and everything else. And this was a copy of his, if I'm not mistaken, this was his passport that he had. And they actually had him bound in books, which I thought was a little strange. He got married again to my grandmother. So this was their marriage license. Lovely looking people, so happy. I can tell you from my trip to China, Bruce, we'd have family photos taken with my family that's in China, and everybody would look like this. It was just really strange. So this is, I guess, very typical. And of course, you had to get your papers, so you could be official. So this is a picture of my grandmother when she came into the country. And you had to have your official document, just like you had to have if you were a Jew in Germany. You had to have your papers, so you were allowed to be around. And apparently my grandfather was also in Fresno, which is the only time I ever saw that referenced. Remember I talked about my uncle, the one I called Uncle Martin? Well, his name was Martin Wall, just like your name, Bruce. We talked about how we're not related, but you never know, Bruce. So this was the only wall I could find, and this was in Mesa, Arizona. Again, a lot of, let's say, ethnically diverse neighborhoods that were outside the main part of town is where he lived. He lived with this other guy named Sam Wong, and he was his companion. I don't know what that means, but they were obviously friends and they lived together. Of course, Mr. Wall was 60 years old. So this is like an old Chinese guy who was living in Mesa. But that's the only wall I could find anywhere around that part of our state. When my grandfather came here, he ended up, that's why he came down to Arizona, was because his wife wanted to be with that child, with Uncle Martin. And so they ended up leasing a space in Chandler where they built a store with all the outbuildings and everything else. And it was listed in the phone book. And do you remember my real name is Jew, so Jew Song, a grocer on Colorado Street, number 1 besides Boston is the name of another street in Chandler. So you could actually look back and see that this is about what Chandler looked like at the time where my grandfather was living there. And if you went and found the right streets and got to the right intersection, there's Boston. And then this is where the other street would have come through. So right in the heart of the municipal buildings now is where he would have been. And this is a copy of the lease that he had for the place that he had to build. He actually did not have to pay any money to lease that space. He was required to pay all the taxes, build a store, improve the lot by adding fencing, all the necessary outbuildings, which I assume means an outhouse and a whatever barn or anything else that might be, and he has to have that all done before the lease expires. So that's the recorded lease. But this was in 1924, and I think this was till 1925. So he had to have all that done in 1 year. And so he was there for a number of years. Of my father's generation, there were 8 children, and 6 of them were born in Chandler. The last 2 were born in Scottsdale. There are records that said we came to Scottsdale in 1929, but they were still in the census in 1930. They were still in Chandler. And the last child in 1931 was still born in Chandler. And then the next child, the 7th child, was born in Scottsdale. So sometime between 31 and thereabouts, that's where they were. And this is the actual, again, we know where Arizona Avenue is in Chandler, and this is the other street where they leased the property from that he had to improve. And it's right there today. The Chandler Automotive looks like almost a junkyard. But things changed. So all my family, this is when they were in the village of Scottsdale. My father was 9 months old. Wait, this is 1936. No, they're still in Chandler on this one. You probably can't see, it says Chandler Precinct. And that's when they started to move to Johnny Rose's Pool Hall. Now, this is an old picture taken when Johnny Rose's Pool Hall was built with wood. It was rebuilt a few years later with brick with a full basement underneath, and there was actually a house behind it. And that's what it looked like back in the probably the late 30s. Here's the house, and this part of the structure is still there. And this is still white because that part is where it is brick, and it's porcelain-fired brick. So if you walk up to it, you can actually feel, it feels like a plate. It's very, they never had to paint it.
I was just about to ask, does it ever have to be painted?
Nope.
That's amazing.
Yeah, smart idea. World War II came around. My grandfather, even though he was a little bit older, he was 52, he signed up to be in the part of the Second World War. Didn't have to serve, but his oldest son served. And this is the first time that they're seen in the 1950 census, everybody living together in Scottsdale. And there's this one right down here, the last one, that's Uncle Martin. Now he has a name of Fong Long Lu, but that is my Uncle Martin. And you can see he is 22, and my oldest uncle was 17, so he was 5 years older. And that's what I have in this little PowerPoint thing. I'm not going to shut my laptop, but did you have some other questions?
I do have some other. Do you know how did he get the store on, how did your grandfather buy the store? Because I thought at the time that Chinese people weren't allowed to purchase land in Arizona.
That's correct. He was, the only reason I can think is he had leased that store since 29 until 35. It was bought at a bankruptcy sale, and he must have known the people, and they must have known that he was of good character, and that's how he was able to buy it. That's the only reason I can think that they let him do it. He bought it for $3,000. Wow. So
You said that the building has a basement. Is the basement used today?
The basement is still used today. There's a stairway that you can get down to that's at the back of the store. There's also a hatch at the front of the store that you can get into the basement with. It's used for storing all the items that are going to be for sale up in the regular part of the store.
Okay. How many first cousins? You said you had 8 uncles and aunts. How many first cousins do you have?
I have 32 first cousins. One of them has passed away, so I have 31 now.
Wow.
And everybody, so that means all of my aunts and uncles had plenty of kids. We had a family reunion a few years back, and not everybody could come, but there was like 125 people there.
Wow. Okay. So what did you learn about your family from the trip to China?
Oh, I learned that my grandfather was a paper son, which was something I did not know before. I learned where he lived. That was new to me. I did not know that before I went to China. I learned how they lived, which was, not something I understood before. I went to multiple villages that were laid out that same way, with the pond and the big tree and the rice fields around there, because they would have town meetings, village meetings, under the big shady tree. And there was always that big kind of concrete area, because that's where they would thrash the rice as well. So very communal. Everybody worked together to get everything done.
Wow, that's interesting. As you're doing your research on your family, what was the biggest challenges?
Part of the challenge is most of the research I did was during COVID. And it was always going down like little rabbit holes. For instance, I saw that the attorney that helped my grandfather come into the country was the same attorney that helped him leave the country and then helped my grandfather and my grandmother come back in. Once I found him, I had to search around and find everything about him, and that there was some place that actually had his records still, the things that he had. Once I got a hold of that place, they said, oh, sure, we will send you what records we have about your grandfather. And that included a whole litany of just little cool pieces. Like, I found out that my grandmother, when she came into the country, she had hookworm, and that the attorney gave $100 to the immigration people saying, she can't be at Angel Island, she is too sick. We'll give you $100, kind of posting a bail for her, and so she could be in San Francisco where she could be taken care of. Her doctor was a woman doctor. Now that's in 1920, which was rather remarkable. The doctor wrote a note after she had the child saying, she is still not well. It was really rough. You need to let her stay here. The attorney went to the immigration people, said, the doctor says she needs to stay in San Francisco for a while longer. The immigration people said, no, she needs to come to Angel Island now. And so they had to take her back to Angel Island with my uncle. And I think about a month later, they let her go. That was a real interesting piece, that if I hadn't dug down and found the attorney and found his records and got all that back and seen all those little notes that were passed back and forth between that little group, I wouldn't have understood that story.
Was your grandfather able to speak multiple languages?
My grandfather could. He could speak Chinese. He could speak English. He could speak Yaqui. He could speak Mexican. I'm not going to say Spanish, because Spanish is different than Mexican. He could speak Apache. I think that's it. But boy, that's a lot.
Did he use those languages for the business?
Yeah, his business was really focused around the brown community. He would carry lots of different kinds of beans and rice, and he was open 7 days a week, because his customers They worked all during the week, and they might be able to come in on the weekend. They for sure would be able to come in on like a Sunday. And I spoke with someone from the Historical Society who just turned 90, and she was born and raised in Scottsdale, and she said when she was growing up, if you needed milk on a Sunday, well, all the stores were closed except for my grandfather's store, J. Chew's, and if you wanted milk, you had to go around to the back and sneak in and get your milk, because Caucasian people it was really deeply frowned upon them to buy anything from that store at all. I asked her also, I said, Eleanor, did you ever go to that store when you were growing up? And she shook her head. Nope, never went.
At what point did your grandfather's store transition into Mexican imports?
In the 1960s, late 50s. I don't have a specific time, but my grandfather and my uncle, Uncle John, who took over running the store, they saw that, or the Chamber of Commerce was making this whole Scottsdale is the most western town, and Malcolm White actually built the first building that had that western facade on it. And so as they did those things, and people wanted those little trinkets like from Mexico, well, they built the relationships with people from Mexico. They would come up and they'd sell them to my grandfather very inexpensively, and he would have them there for the tourists to buy. When I was growing up, I remember going in there, and there would still be the Coke machines and ice cream. But then there were all these, and they still had some groceries, but they'd have these other things as well. It was not a, we're closing today and tomorrow will be Mexican imports. It kind of evolved.
Who runs the store today?
My cousins, remember I have 32. Cousins Janie and Roseanne run the store, although they've started transitioning out because they're my age. I'll be 69 in a few weeks. So.
Okay. Can you explain your grandfather's name and how it was switched?
Chinese names are always family name first. So they would know that, for instance, you would be Wall Bruce, and I would be Song Jason. But once they started seeing, your last name, well, in America, it's your last name is your family name. Well, they just started doing that as the kids were born. I mean, all their last names were Song on their birth certificates. I got copies of all their birth certificates, which are much different than today's birth certificates. It's like a little note. Oh, they were born.
Right. So your grandfather's last name was actually
Chu or Joe.
Okay.
Yeah, like Zhou Enlai. I know that some people might remember that famous politician from China, but that's in the top 20 names of China.
Okay, so Song, your family name now, was actually his first
given name. Wow. And you saw on the little family tree thing that I have great grandfathers and great great grandfathers that was their name as well.
And was that part of your research? Did you discover that, or did you already know that?
I knew that. I'd found that out a long time ago.
Okay. What was the biggest revelation for you? Was it the paper sun?
No, it was not the paper tiger. It was the paper sun and all the things that happened with Angel Island, and just it was just so interesting to see all the timelines of things. My grandfather literally got off the boat and got into the United States the same day, and my grandmother didn't. It was all the iterations or all the things she had to go through to get into the country. That was interesting because you always think about people, getting in fairly easily. Now it was quite the ordeal, and You know, there were people on Angel Island for years. That was just so kind of a sad thing.
Okay. Have you ever done DNA? And was that any information?
It was good information. My father's all Chinese, so I'm 50% Chinese. My mother told me that, well, your grandfather was German and her mother was Swedish. So I thought, well, this should be pretty simple, you know, 50% Chinese, 25% German, 25% Swedish. Well, that wasn't the case. 50% Chinese was right there, boom. 43% Swedish, 2% German, 2% Sicilian. Just ended up being kind of a weird little thing.
So that was, I'm sure, a revelation.
That was a revelation, something I wasn't expecting.
Okay. And if someone was to approach you today and say, hey, I just want to get started in searching for my family, what sort of advice would you have for them? What sort of tools would you recommend for them?
You know, Ancestry is really good, but you have to pay for it. If you go to the Scottsdale Public Library, you can have access to the library version, which means you get into everything, but you can't save it to your tree very easily. I haven't tried that one yet. The newspapers are a great source of information. Again, there's the newspapers database. There's also the Family Heritage database, which is free, I believe. I'm not sure of the name, but there is a free one that's run by the Latter-day Saints. Carries a lot of the information as well. I would do that for Asian people going through the National Archives in San Francisco and Seattle were a really good source of information, especially for that time frame that I was at. The census data is really great. Just this last year, I think, they opened up the 1950 census database, which again is really enlightening. One thing, of course, my Chinese family was very interesting, and I did a lot of research with that. I also found out a lot of information about my mom. She actually told my wife one time when they were drinking scotch that she'd been married 4 times. And I found at least twice that she'd been married. And those relatives are all gone as well. But I thought that was very interesting to see. And just found out a lot of information about her, but different than the Chinese stuff.
Can you talk about how you use the Scottsdale Historical Society and the libraries, Scottsdale Heritage Connection? Was that valuable in your search?
You know, it was, especially when it came to all my aunts and uncles all went to Scottsdale High. So it was great to see all of their high school pictures and all the things they were involved with. My uncle, George, who was, like 5'5", was on the basketball team. So that was great to see. And of course, seeing all the stuff they wrote in the yearbooks was kind of fun too. Because there's only like one yearbook for every year that's in the heritage section. And I remember reading one where my dad wrote to his sister. He said, well, I'm going to give you, because they were all the seniors were giving things to the younger generation, the younger kids that were in high school. Said, I'm giving you my good looks and charm. just kind of wacky stuff like that. Yeah, very interesting to see things that happened in their high school days, which obviously none of their kids knew about.
Did you learn anything about your father that you didn't know, or mother?
I learned that my mother was involved in theater a lot more than I thought. That husband that she had before my dad, that she had had with my stepsister with, was very much involved in theater, not only in Phoenix, but also when he moved later to New Mexico. I found out my dad, I thought, was always a character, and he was even more of a character than I thought. A few years back, I was having to clean out the basement of my dad's stuff down the basement underneath Mexican Imports. And there was so many things that I was just throwing out right and left. There were 8 crock pots down there. Who needs 8 crock pots, you know, and old sinks, and here's this old paperwork. And then you'd find something really interesting once in a while. Here's my dad's high school diploma, you know, wonderful things. Oh, here's another picture that somebody drew of my dad, and here's another thing like that. God, I don't have room for that. And just threw out probably 95% of the stuff. A little while later, thanks to the library's collection of photographs, there was a photograph of the inside of the Pink Pony, a very famous restaurant and bar that had caricatures of all these famous baseball players and all these characters of Scottsdale that were around. And I looked and I said, wait, is that little picture, that's that picture of my dad that I threw out. And I was just like, oh.
It was a Don Barclay?
Yeah, I think so.
Wow.
Yeah, and was just, you know, I was sad that I threw that out. But then I was, you know, I spent weeks cleaning his crap out of the basement, just weeks. So, yeah.
Well, is there anything that I haven't touched on that you'd like to mention?
You know, the only thing I would say is that people should take the time to talk to their older relatives now. You'd be surprised about the funny stories that you hear. I talked to one of my aunties that lived with my grandfather, and she said he was retired, and every day he would go out, and he had a whole series of Chinese plum trees around their house that was at Indian School in Miller. And he would go out, and instead of taking the hose out to the trees, he would just fill the bucket up, he'd pick up the bucket, and he'd walk over to the tree, and then he'd water it that way. And he'd go back and fill the bucket, and did that to every tree, every day. He would actually, I had heard that he actually would take those plums that would come from the trees and sell them to a merchant in San Francisco. But he also was able to sit on his back patio and look up at Camelback Mountain, and he would said to her how the mountain would just embrace him and gave him such peace. He was a poet as well. He wrote some really good poetry. So talk to those older people, get their stories. They'll be funny, they'll be sad, but they'll be stories you should hear, because once they're gone, the stories are gone.
Thank you, Jason, for your time today, and I know that people in our future will enjoy watching this.
Thank you so much, Bruce.